Okay, in this video we are going to look at when to use rows with CSS Grid. So before we get into that, let's just do a quick refresher of how we use CSS Grid to set up just an overall page layout. So I'm going to just put together like a basic layout here. So we're going to get a little bit of content. So we've got header. We'll put an H1 in here. This is my heading. We'll say paragraph times 4, lorem, 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 and lorem. So that's in the main. And then in the aside, we'll just do a quick unordered list. And then let's just put some stuff in here. And then down here in the footer, we'll just do a quick copyright. So we'll say, and copy 2020 basic layout. Okay, so now I have my 4 elements. And we're going to just do like a quick setup for this page layout. So the parent element here is the div with the class of wrapper. So let's say dot wrapper, and then we'll say display grid. We'll set up some columns, grid, template, columns. We'll say repeat 4, comma 1 fr. So we're going to have 4 equal size columns. So that's all we've done. That's all we need for our grid for this example. 4 columns. We'll put the header across. I'm going to use the shorthand here for a grid column. So we'll say grid columns start at 1, end at 5. So that's going to go all the way across. And then for the main, we'll say grid column 1/4. So it starts at 1, ends at 4. And now you can see we've got the main spanning like 3/4 of our container, and the aside is falling into that last column. And then for the footer, we basically want to have the exact same position on the grid as the header. So I'm just going to chain these selectors here, and then that footer, it's not going to visually look any different, but is now covering all 4. So you'll see here in 10 lines of CSS, we've gone from having all the content stacked on top of each other to having like a pretty basic conventional layout with a sidebar. And if we wanted to inspect this, if we're in Firefox, we can go to Inspect Element. We can select the Layout tab in our developer tools. Then we can click on that div class of wrapper, which is where we displayed grid. And then we can see the grid that we have set up. So you can see we've got our 4 columns here, 2, 3, 4. But you'll also notice that we have 3 rows. So we have this row, and this row. And we didn't generate any rows. We didn't make any declarations about grid template rows. What CSS Grid has done for us, it has provided us with what are called implicit rows. Because of the way that we have applied the content to our columns, the browser decided to make rows to accommodate for the rest of the content. So we didn't have to do anything with rows, but we still have them, and we can still place things on the rows if we wanted to. But that's not what this video is about. That is just a quick reminder of why we usually don't even need to use rows. But there are situations where you might want to have rows. First of all, you might want to overlap one element over another in like a certain part of that element. You might want to have some empty vertical white space, and in things like that, rows come in really handy. So let's look at some examples of what we might use for this. So I'm just going to get rid of all of this, and then I will leave the grid declaration because I'll just use another div of the class of wrapper. So we'll say wrapper, and we'll say box 1, and then let's do box 2. Oops. And then let's put a heading in here. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to set up a container that's going to have a colored box here and a colored box here, and I want those to overlap kind of in the middle of the page. So I want one box positioned in the top left-hand corner and the other one positioned in the bottom right-hand corner, and I want the content, I want the two corners to overlap in the middle. So let's look at how we would do that. So right now we have we've just set up display of grid, and these are not the columns that I want to use anymore. So to get the effect that I want to have, I'm going to say 1FR 100 pixels 1FR. So I've got a 3-column grid now, and we can validate that if we do inspect element, go to layout, click on div with the class of wrapper. Now we can see this. Okay, cool. So I'm going to leave these developer tools open because they're going to come in handy. Okay, so let's add some rows. So we could say grid template rows, and I kind of want to do the exact same thing here. So I'll say 1FR 100 pixels 1FR. Okay, now we can see that I have these rows generated. There's nothing in them because there's no content, but we're going to fix that soon. So I also want to make sure that this is the full height of my available browser window. So we'll say min-height 100 VH. So that stands for viewport height units. And you can see now that my container is 100 viewport units high. And it continues to change size as the browser window changes too. Okay, cool. So now that we have that, now let's start addressing those two boxes. So let's first of all give box 1 a background color. So we'll say BG pink. And then box 2, we'll say BG, whoops, that is not what I wanted, light blue. Okay, so there's my boxes. And I'm going to need to, since CodePen auto refreshes, I'm going to need to add those things to my actual CSS that I had done in the developer tools. So we'll say min height 100 VH. Okay, cool. So now what I want to do is I want to place my pink box here, and I want to place my blue box here. So I'm going to say on box 1. So let's take the main event out of here for just the moment. So for box 1, actually I don't want to do that. It's going to defeat the purpose. Okay, so for box 1, let's go ahead and get that grid inspector back on. Okay, so box 1, I want that to be grid column. And I'm going to use the shorthand here, so we're going to start at 1 and end at 3. Okay, and then I'm going to place it on the rows. So I'm going to say grid row 1/3. So same thing. Okay, great. Now I'm going to set that up for the light blue one. So we'll say grid column 2/4. Okay, and then grid row 2/4. So same thing. And now you'll see that they overlap here in the middle, and that's kind of cool. Okay, great. So what do we do about this heading here? Well, let's select it, and we'll say grid row 2/3. And then we need to place it on the columns. So for the moment, we'll say grid column. Let's just do 2/4 for the second. for this, missed my semicolon here. And then we want to say z index of 5, so we get it on top of our content. And now we have our text there, so that's great. Let's find some like cool Bauhausy font to use here. So I'm just going to search Bauhaus, see if anything comes up. Okay, cool. Bauhaus 93. We'll use this. Oh, I see. It's wanting me to pay for it. Okay. Let's see. Gotham. None of these are really striking me, but here we go. We'll do this one. Seems relatively along the lines of what I want. So we'll click embed. We're going to do this. Then we'll come back to our CodePen. Stick this in the top of our HTML. And then we'll copy our CSS to apply to the H1. There we go. Let's give it a bigger font size. Font size 46 pixels. Cool. And font weight normal. All right, cool. So now we have semi-interesting visual overlay here. And why don't we go ahead and use our CSS writing mode that we learned about in the typography video mode. This is one of those properties that I always have to look up. So here we go. I'm going to copy this. And then we'll go back to our tab and put that in there. All right. So the reason that this is all cramped in here, just as a reminder, if we do the overlay, we can see that we put it in the just this middle row. So if we were to change the grid row to be 2/4, then we're going to have it coming straight down here. So that's kind of interesting. We've been able to use a combination of CSS writing modes to get the vertical text here. We've used grid and grid rows to our advantage to be able to overlay two different elements and create some vertical white space here that's not content dependent. So you can kind of see how if you were to use like a texture as a background or semi-transparency and then overlay part of this over an image or something like that, or maybe have some text in a cell that is overlaying an image, you could then use the filters and mix blend modes to start doing some really interesting graphic design type work using combinations of all of the things that we've learned about thus far. So that is when to use rows and how to kind of create different layouts using CSS Grid. I hope you found that useful.